specification and the
Okay.
assessment criteria before we jump on to starting the discussion. So yesterday we did learning outcome one predominantly, I think,
Yeah, we
focused
did.
on understanding your own role and looking at some key bits of legislation, regulatory requirements, and obviously how do you work as a team with your peers and colleagues, whether it is within the setup or outside when you deal with professional bodies or other regulatory bodies. And then we looked at the points of referral for identifying needs of learners. This is what we're going to go into a bit more detail today, which is going to be looking at the resources, the initial assessments, the diagnostics, the learning style, VART learning style questionnaire that we are aware of. And those are the bits that allow us to, understand the needs and requirements of our learners so that when we are teaching and delivering, obviously we are able to tailor and, make the teaching and let's say the delivery in the class or online much more meaningful, which is meeting the requirements and suits the requirements of our learners that we are teaching. The second learning outcome is focused on this aspect, which is initial and diagnostic assessment, to make sure that the learners that we take on for the process of learning, teaching and learning, we agree and understand what their goals are, what their capability is, and then accordingly put resources and other, let's say, things in place to ensure that the learning is meaningful. There are 4 assessment criteria. We'll go through all of them in a bit more detail, but we would be looking at obviously putting in some templates here to try and obviously the reason of putting in these templates is to try and understand, what is the theory, and obviously in some cases, let's say, when we take up some examples, the idea would be to try and look at underpinning some of the theoretical frameworks which have over the years been studied, recognized, and now very well established, which help us and aid us as teachers, tutors, trainers, whichever way we call it, to be able to understand our learners better and obviously make the sessions meaningful. So let's look at a couple of things in terms of the overarching, meaning, and obviously how do we interpret this particular learning outcome. So let's start with that. It says be able to use initial and diagnostic assessment. So when I use the word diagnostic assessment, what comes to your mind? Anything that comes to your mind when we talk about diagnostic assessments?
I'm just trying to remember them now. So initial would be like, for example, like a quiz or a kind of like
Correct.
maybe end of like I think I was talking to you about it yesterday, like an end of unit
That's
quiz
correct.
or assessment to
Absolutely. So the reason why we look at these diagnostic assessments is to understand our learners' strengths, weaknesses.
where they're at and how
Uh,
to sort of progress.
yeah, that could also be something that we can interpret because it is a very vital component of, I would say any process. Specifically, when we look at teaching and learning, it could be, as you said, progress part of it. If learners are taking up a particular qualification or a course, they might be progressing from a previous qualification that they've completed. So it could be to assess whether they have the suitability to be able to do that or the skills and knowledge to be able to study that. It could also be used for, say, for example, assessing strengths and weaknesses. And sometimes when we look at quiz, or I know that we get a lot of learners who do functional skills with us. And when we look at functional skills, if they say we want to do a level 2 or a level 1, then what we do is we give them some sort of an initial diagnostic to say, can you fill up this particular, can you take this particular short exam or a test, which basically allows us to basically understand very clearly whether they are at that particular level of what they are saying, and that allows.
It gives you like a baseline, doesn't it?
That's
Baseline
correct.
from
Yeah,
where to start from.
absolutely. And in such cases, there could be different types of assessments which are done. So we went into and mentioned, like, you do a quiz, you do a discussion, you do a test. you do an exam, or in some cases, you practically ask them to demonstrate a skill. And that could be in the case of, for example, if somebody's studying a computer language, or if it's somebody's taking up a health and safety or a health and any sort of a course. So sometimes when we do teaching observations, there is of course a bit of micro teaching, and that is basically testing your ability. And in those cases, it is basically a form of assessment which is being done. And what we are expecting in such cases is that the assessment that we undertake or we ask the person to do is basically practically showing us, how it is happening. Now, in most cases, we also look at doing assessments which are to detect special learning, say, for example, difficulties or special educational needs. And in such cases, diagnostics can be done primarily through trained trained professionals. And in some cases, when we say early years practitioners, specifically in some disciplines and areas, and it could also be people who have a specialization or understanding in terms of being a psychologist or a specialist teacher. And that is where SENS as a category also comes in when we talk about initial diagnostics or assessments which are undertaken to understand any sort of learning difficulty the learner would have. And then we accordingly tailor bespoke or provide bespoke resources which would meet that particular requirement. Now, assessments in general, if I use the word, there are 16 different types of assessment. We don't want to go into that, but anything related to any sort of diagnostics that we are doing, which is basically helping us understand, I would say, the capability of the learner, which could be strengths and weaknesses, knowledge and skills, and anything which allows us to understand their capability before they get into any sort of further studies or take up a further study in terms of course, qualification, whatever it is. It'll help us to put that in the context of, looking at, yes, the learner meets all the requirements, and that is where the diagnostics and the results confirm that this is the case. Now, when we look at lots of different types of initial and diagnostic assessments, there could be various reasons, as we've discussed very briefly, they are conducted. So it could be to look at initial assessment, which is when we talk about learning styles and their ways in which they are able to learn, or what could be the most effective and efficient way in which the learner can actually be given training or given the material to be able to gain knowledge and skills. So one such thing that we look at sometimes tends to be the learning style questionnaires, which we ask the learners to complete. And that's a template here that we end up using, obviously, at our own place as well. But this particular learning style, or VARC learning style questionnaire, as we call it, tends to give us a very good understanding of what is the best way in which the learner would actually comprehend, understand, and obviously at some stage, learn, in terms of what is being provided as information. There could be other methods which we generally look at, and the idea would be to start with some sort of learning style questionnaires, which basically help us understand, what are the styles in which the learners can actually be made more, given an environment wherein they are able to learn more effectively. And this was put forward by Neil Fleming in the 1980s. And since then on, it has become a very effective tool for teachers, educators, trainers, and tutors to be able to basically understand what are the preferences of learners, whether they are visual, whether they are auditory, they learn more from reading and writing or doing activities, or they are more kinesthetic. So these 4 learning styles, over the years have now become quite a standard and very well accepted. And what these tell us is that, in general, if I put it this way, that it gives me an information on ways in which I can best take in and process that information as a learner. They can also be related to what we looked at yesterday, David Klopp's learning style model, wherein he talks about more of experiences. But in general, when we look at VARC in particular, And what Neil Fleming proposed was, sorry, ways in which the educators, teachers, trainers need to make the information more palatable. And that means that they would use this to determine the style in which the learner actually prefers learning, and then tailor the delivery of material in a way which allows them to best take in and process the information which is provided for the purposes of learning. Now, this could be one template that we could attach, as a bit of a evidence to say that one of our learners have, filled this up, or this is one of the initial diagnostic, assessment that you normally do with kids or children, or essentially students and learners who are looking at studying or doing a particular course.
So you would do it with one of my students?
Yeah, we normally send this across to students who are looking at studying a higher level qualification. And
so you want me to complete it for me, or for my students in my class?
No, you can do it one for yourself just to find out. I did it a number of years back when I was doing my PGCE, because this is something I became aware of, and obviously I did it myself. But we normally give it to the students, and obviously you could have this filled in by one or two of your students, which will be attached as an annexure. Now, obviously, there are other ways. We also do lots of different types of initial assessment. And these initial assessments, if I put it this way, can be used again for diagnostic purpose.
So would that be just kind of attached in as like a summary, or?
Yeah, attached in like a summary, because what tends to happen is this particular work style questionnaire that you take has, depending on, how it has been developed, but typically tends to have not more than 20, 25 questions, and each of these questions you normally read and you answer depending on what you feel is the most suitable option. And then towards the end, what you end up doing is each of the options that are there, 4 of the options, A, B, C, D, in the background there is a bit of numbering which has been done on them. And what you do is you sum up and do the totals. And when you have done the totals by looking at what options you've chosen, it then lets you arrive at a score, and that score then tells you whether you are a visual, auditory, read or write, or kinesthetic learner.
I did this before for my level 3, but I can't remember what I had. But in terms of just doing it with the students, I do it for a couple of the students as well, and then obviously then that can go in somewhere into my evidence that I'm gathering for this unit. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
Now, the other bit which I've brought up just on the screen right now is basically another form of a quiz or a test that we ask learners to undertake, and that tends to be, what is called the diagnostic assessment again, but it is primarily for understanding what level of English they have. And again, it's a questionnaire or an exam that we normally give to the learners and ask them to complete in about 20 minutes. We mark it, and then we know at what level their English is, what areas they are weak in, what are the gap areas. For example, in English, we look at punctuation, grammar, tone of voice, style of writing, different aspects of, say, for example, understanding where the learner's skills are in terms of English as a language. And each of these sections help us in understanding where at the end of it, once we mark, it helps us understand what are the areas which the learner is weak in, what are the areas which the learner does not understand, and in what areas we feel that the learner has good grasp on, I would say, skills and knowledge with regards to English as a language. And then what we do is we use this particular diagnostic test that we have done to basically create an ILP, or an individual learning plan. And that individual learning plan, specifically for learners who are learning language, English as a language, is put together wherein we break it down into various sections. So reading would have 8 sections, writing would have 8 sections, speaking, listening would have 8 sections. And then accordingly, workbooks, resources, activities, and classes are scheduled so that they are able to then start getting into and understanding the areas of weakness, and then obviously looking at improving on the areas of weakness as they go along and studying the course, English as a language, and ESOL, or English as a language course. So this is another form of diagnostic that we look at. And again, the reason why we look at this diagnostic is to primarily understand the learner's ability, knowledge, skill, it's his or her current knowledge and skill, and obviously strength and weakness areas. Now, some of the points that we need to know why initial in diagnostics or initial assessments, as we call it, initial assessment or diagnostic assessments are done are primarily to look at getting hold of or getting a good hold on the understanding of the initial knowledge of the learner, also understanding the strengths and weakness areas, looking at understanding and analyzing the areas that the learner would need to have targets or smart targets that we develop with in tandem with the learner at some stage, so that there are milestones that we are able to cover in order to get over those weakness areas, or let's say improve those weakness areas. And then at some stage, the ILPs, look at having targets in them that this particular area, which has been, uncovered as a gap area or a weakness area, would be these are the set of activities that will be undertaken. Each of these activities will lead to this result, and hopefully, at the end of a timeline that we also put, say 3 months down the line, once all these activities have been completed, the learner should have gained knowledge and the relevant skills to be able to then say that, okay, this is an area that I've covered, this is an area that I've improved on, and this is a skill that I've gained at the end of it. And that is where at some stage you in the ILP, first is you list down, for example, some of the macro objectives, but at a later stage, once we know very clearly from the initial diagnostics, whichever way it has been carried out, quiz, test, exam, initial assessment. But at some stage, when we know where the gap areas are, what we do is then put them into smart targets. What the reason of saying smart targets is because we know they are specific targets, they are measurable targets, they are achievable targets, they are realistic. That means it is something which the learner can actually achieve by completing a number of milestones or activities over a point in time. And the T stands for being time bound. They are not open-ended targets. They are not targets that would be set wherein it will take years or months or years for the learner to be able to do it. But they are time realistic targets that we normally tend to put in. And one of the things that we definitely do before these SMART goals or targets are set, the learner has to agree to those SMART goals and targets, and that is how they are put into the ILP, that there is an agreement in terms of the learning process, there is an agreement in terms of the goal which is to be achieved, and that is where the tutor, trainer, instructor, teacher, lecturer would work with the student by defining the activities which are required to be completed, and those, along with the appropriate availability of resources, allow students to cover milestones, and these milestones at some stage would allow the student to develop those skills, or the areas in which they are lacking would be able to then look at gaining those skills. Now, the critical part of the setting up of goals and targets in the ILP is also to look at monitoring it. So there's a regular review which tends to happen. These regular or periodic reviews are done in order to ensure that there is sufficient progress being made. And in some cases, what tends to also happen is that we need to adapt or change or, let's say, amend some of these goals, because or timeline in some cases, if we do see the progress happening ahead of time, if we do see progress not happening as per the timeline defined, then the adjustments can also be made so that again, the activities, resources, and the efforts being put are meaningful in order to allow the learner to be able to gain, those skills, or remove some of the weaknesses or overcome some of the weaknesses for which the individual learning plan or these goals have been set. A simple example that I've obviously used in my case as a teacher for strategic management is that when I carry out the initial diagnostics or ask the learners to do these tests, it is to primarily understand that whether they are suitable to study, they are eligible, and one is the eligibility in terms of being able to study a particular course at a particular level, and the second is to also look at their ability to be able to, understand and obviously gain the knowledge which is required by studying the course with us. So sometimes some of these things tend to be depending on the academic documentation, which is to say, if you're looking at doing a master's degree or a master's diploma, then do you have a bachelor's or an equivalent qualification at level 6? And that would be tested academically because documentation will be provided. In some cases, we will need to check by doing diagnostic assessment, and that would be to say, can you develop a business plan? Can you come up with a vision and mission of the organization? And for certain courses, obviously, we need to be able to see whether they are able to put the experience, the knowledge that they have into practice, and that would then allow us to understand whether they are suitable for this course or not. And sometimes, if we do take them on, we know that they have the suitability, they have the eligibility, but obviously they need support and guidance to be able to sharpen some of the things that they need to study the course. Then in those cases, actions, or I would put it this way, goals are set, and along with certain goals, timeline is also set, so that and the learner then agrees at the end of the day. That is why on ILPs, when we look at most ILPs, individual learning plans, it is not just the learner which signs the ILP, it is a tutor and the learner both signing the ILP, because they need to be in agreement to accept the goals which have been set, and the learner needs to accept, the tutor or the teacher needs to set the goals, explain why the goals have been set, what resources and activities or areas would be covered while completing those activities. But at the same time, the learner needs to sign the plan off to say that he or she accepts that plan, and that gets the buy-in from the learner to say that, yes, I would be undertaking these personalized learning goals, and these goals would then support my enhancement of my knowledge and skills. And this approach then allows learning and learning outcomes to be meaningful, which means one, the organization or the institution is also meeting the standards in terms of, say, if I look at universities, one of the things their ranking depends on is the placements that they do and the completion of course, which the learners do at the end of the year. If the completion rates fall, the ranking falls. If they're not able to get pre-placement or placement for students into jobs at the end of their course, again, it has an effect on their ranking. And this can also overall affect the educational journey of the learner, because over a point in time, if the reputation and ranking of the university keeps falling, then at some stage this will have a knock-on effect on how the university is perceived when new students look at prospective admissions. So it is a very important part as far as teachers are concerned, tutors or trainers are concerned, and diagnostics is something which we cannot ignore. And it is
No.
something which is used as a very effective tool as a teacher to be able to understand individual requirements and needs and put resources, activities, and areas around those needs to be able to make the education journey meaningful, and thereby also achieving, I would put it this way, some of the qualitative targets which are set within the institutions for teachers, and also to look at standards that we discussed yesterday. So meeting the off-call standard, that means number of students passing year on year, or the grades, improvement in the average grades of the student year on year. And that is where the Ofsted gradings, then link into in the background as far as standards are concerned. Is that okay?
Yep.
Now, with this particular understanding, let's look at some of the assessment criteria. Now, the first one talks about why is it important to identify and meet the individual need of learners. So if I talk about meeting the individual needs of learners, sometimes what we do is we classify and we talk about, meeting the needs of individual learners is because why we want to make sure, when learners study with us, we are able to provide opportunities, we are able to provide or have practices within the institution, within the setup, to be able to ensure that there are enough learning opportunities available which basically meet the interests of the learners or of the students. And this particular aspect of meeting the individual need also looks at meeting one of the let's say, one of the important or crucial criteria is related to guidance and information and support, which is required to provide or deliver effective learning. And that would mean in some cases learners, if they have any difficulties or if they are having learning experiences which are not conducive, then in such cases, the delivery, or I would say that would basically tell me two things. One, either the learning needs are not clearly identified for the learner, or in some cases, the delivery needs to be altered in order to ensure that it is meaningful for the learners. So when we do talk about individual learning experiences and looking at the resource utilization, motivation and engagement of learners in the classroom, between the teacher and the learners in the classroom, it is looking at ultimately identifying the needs so that we are able to provide meaningful resources. We are able to deliver sessions or conduct our classroom sessions in a way which are, highly, in which the learners are motivated and engaged with us to be able to essentially further the process of teaching and learning. And that is going to help us align with the learner's goal. So when we do talk about, meeting individual needs, it is about understanding what the learners want and then fostering a learning environment which basically is going to allow the learning to be more conducive, more participative. I would put it this way, more conducive in the sense that it is something which the learners are looking forward to in terms of attending the session, or for example, making sure that the teachers are able to have, let's say, adequate resources, which could be in the form of, say, for example, specific requirements for a learner, looking at addressing maybe physical disabilities or any sort of linguistic barriers if there are there, if they are teaching in a diverse environment, then in such cases, anything which is going to impediment or be an impediment to the learning process, which could be things like emotional barriers, it could be, physical disabilities, or in some cases, we also talk about the cognitive abilities which might not be present across all the learners in the classroom. And in such cases, what we're looking at is the teachers coming in and obviously coming in and doing the diagnostics to be able to identify the needs of the learners, thereby ensuring that the environment they create is allowing for adjustment and allowances for particular type of learners who would need to study in a particular way, and that would accommodate, that would look at creating an atmosphere of accommodation, and that as a whole would allow the whole prospect or process of learning, with the prospect much more easier and I would say, um, let's say, much more holistic and better. So in most cases, when I put it this way, that we need to identify the needs of learners, we need to be able to look at their learning styles, any sort of special abilities or disabilities that they have because of which they need augmentation in terms of resources. And if there are any barriers, emotional, physical, psychological, or any sort of barriers which are there, they need to be identified so that the learning which is going to be delivered, the sessions that we prepare, and the delivery that we do in the classroom are geared to basically meet the requirements of the learner. Now, if I were to ask a question, why is it important to understand and identify the needs of learners? I think there are a few things which will come to your mind naturally. One is you want the learning to be effective. You want to meet and teach us, because as a teacher, I'm not teaching anything. I'm teaching as per the curriculum which has been set. So in order for the outcomes to be met, we need to ensure that we are able to create an inclusive, say, learning environment. That learning environment should be free from any sort of disability or barriers, which could be any sort of a barrier. And those barriers, physical, emotional, psychological, language barriers, whatever you call it, they would then be looking at creating impediments or difficulties for the teacher to be able to get things across to its learners. So in order to maximize, I would say, the effectiveness of learning, it is important to identify the learner needs at the very beginning. And this allows us to, I would say, tailor our delivery to meet the requirements of the learner. Now, if I've got generally very enthusiastic learners in the class, for example, or learners which are quite intelligent and they are quite motivated and quite participative, then some of the activities that I plan in terms of the classroom-based delivery or online delivery would be such which will encourage more of participation, and obviously that would make the learning more effective at the end of the day. Then sometimes we also look at this particular term, which is promoting inclusivity within our learning, or what we sometimes say, creating inclusive, learning environments. So when we talk about inclusive learning environments in teaching and or in higher education, what we're essentially saying is that the inclusive learning and teaching recognize that, I would say, all students need to have some sort of a learning experience which values diversity, or in some cases, not all, but values, say, for example, diversity, understanding of the culture, and also enables participation from learners by removing any barriers which could be, say, for example, hurdles to promoting what is called, motivational learning within a classroom. And sometimes you would also say that an inclusive classroom, is important. That the teachers need to create this climate because it refers to an environment wherein the students feel supported, they feel intellectually challenged, or they feel that they are being supported intellectually and academically to be able to achieve the best possible outcomes, given the resources within a particular setup. So it it could be the way how you interpret, but sometimes when we look at learners with difficulties, or sometimes when we look at learners with disabilities, and then in such cases, it becomes important for the teachers and educators to look at ensuring that they have created an environment with adequate resources, which then can be used by learners having those disabilities to be feeling that they are treated as equal, or it also allows them to learn effectively as some of the others in the class. And that is where, you look at the initial assessment and diagnostics to find out if there are any special educational needs, if there are any disabilities, and that uh, person might have a disability, but that might not be necessarily creating a hurdle for the person to learn or gain knowledge. But sometimes you have disabilities which translate into advantages. Sometimes you have disabilities which translate into ensuring not so much in terms of advantage, but we need to, as educators or trainers or teachers, need to ensure that we have resources that we can provide which allow them to overcome those difficulties and feel normal as they would normally do. When we look at any other learner in the classroom or in some sort of a classroom-based setting. Now, another point that I would say sometimes comes up is that understanding learners' need also means that you're able to understand and engage with the learner, which means you are delivering in a classroom or in a setting which creates the wholeness or the feeling of motivation, and generally pushes or gives the comfort to the learners or students in this case to say that they should be looking at achieving it, they should be looking at completing it, finishing it. And this would mean that there is attention and obviously reciprocation, which tends to happen from the learner's side as well. And this would generally be seen as that it gives a boost to the engagement between the learner and the teacher and the learning that is happening within the classroom. So sometimes we see this in terms of translation, and I mention it this way, that sometimes when you look at electives which happen in schools, especially for the secondary school, sometimes you see students actually missing out on their electives, or they don't want to go to the electives and they prefer going to a detention or prefer taking some additional any other additional work in order to avoid that particular session or elective, is because there is no engagement with the learner. The motivation of the learner is low, and there has not been any efforts being put in from the teachers to be, let's put it this way, to ensure that they are able to, motivate learners to be able to come in and attend the class. So what we get to see in some cases is in electives, the attendance falls. In order for the attendance to be improved, there is requirement of engagement between the students, the parents, and the teachers to ensure that the electives or the sessions which learners or students are asked to attend tend to be more meaningful, which would promote, a better sort of coordination and engagement between teachers and students, thereby increasing the attendance in the class. Now, even after doing or making sure that enough resources are put and the delivery is suited to meet the needs of the learners in the classroom, sometimes you still have to provide personalized learning, let's put it this way, solutions to, or let's say, approaches to certain learners. And those could be because the learning which is happening with the learners could be differentiated learning. It could be a pace at which the way in which the learners learn, and that would be varying of pace in terms of how they would learn, within a classroom or within a particular subject area. And in such cases, when you look at history as a subject, for example, or geography as a subject in high school, we generally see that, the teachers would normally set homework or give homework to learners on the basis of how the learners are actually doing or performing in those, in terms of grades in those subject areas. And in such cases, if they feel that the learner would not be meeting the grade, then they would put personalized learning pathway or plans in place to ensure that the learners do not get left behind. And the addition of activities and special attention on enabling some of the learners to progress at their own pace allows the learner not to feel not to get left behind, but at the same time allows progress to be made from a teacher's perspective. So it is about understanding individual needs, because if I have a class and in the class I have 10 learners or 10 students, I might have 2 students which are absolutely brilliant, 4 which are good, 3 could be average, and 1 or 2 could be below average. So my aim.
So I think, sorry to interrupt you, but so I think that's for me an advantage of working in a small school, because we've only got I think we've got 60 kids in total. So for me, I think that's a real advantage, as I'm sure my previous colleague Emily would agree, that we know the students, we have time to spend with the students, we're able to kind of put all these sort of approaches and principles into place in terms of have that time to kind of differentiate the work where needed, or task or activities, so to progress at their own pace. Whereas if you've got a class of 30 secondary school kids in a mainstream setting, there's no way you're going to be able to do that. So I think by having that small setting within the school that I work within, which is fantastic, we're doing this and it was just when you were sort of talking about being inclusive and engaging with learners and stuff, I think as a staff team, we're all very, very strong at doing that, because for that reason that we have got a maximum of 10 learners in the class at any one time. Yeah, they're 10 very different learners, they're all very different, they're all individual, but I think it allows us to be able to do all that extra stuff that you might not be able to focus on within, if you're working in a mainstream school, for example. So I do all this all the time, engage with them. That's actually some of the good feedback that I've got, that they're engaged, the students are engaged. So obviously I'm doing something right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it totally agree. Sometimes the student.
I know the students, so I know kind of, I've been there now, obviously, and I've been there for quite a long time, which I think again helps because I've seen obviously some of the students I started with 3.5 years ago in year 7, they're now sort of about to come up, some of them to sixth form in September. So I've kind of been on that learning journey with them. So now I have a good kind of understanding already, because I've been in that, in that position of a support system for like the last 3.5 years. So I think that obviously gives me kind of that added advantage as well.
I totally agree. And I think that's the
So in
point.
terms of when I'm planning like my lessons and stuff, kind of I know what kind of works and what doesn't work, if that makes sense.
That's correct,
And
yes.
then I've got two groups, like a mixture of Key Stage 4 and 5 for RSE, relationships and sexual education. So there's 3 groups in total. So there's a lower one, a middle one, and a higher one. So I've got 2 of the 3 groups, so middle and higher. So generally their lessons are similar. But I was doing some planning today, just this afternoon, and I was like, yeah, that activity would work better with them than them. And do you know what I mean? You just kind of you'll just do it, or you're doing it automatically now, I think, without thinking. So when you're talking about this, I'm like, yeah, I do that and I do that. So obviously it's good for me because I'm obviously starting to link things together, which I don't always find very easy, shall we say.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that is the point, which is student teacher ratio, and that obviously
Yeah,
helps on both ends. So it
yeah,
improves,
100%.
it helps you learn, and it helps you get to know your learner very
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
And that way the learning tends to be more effective and more meaningful. So as you rightly said, so I think what we need to look at is, if we know as teachers the needs of our learners, and we know our learners very well in general, then and if we know the needs of how they would learn, what would be the conducive environment that we need to create, what resources they need, that would allow us to better understand and obviously make our delivery much more effective.
Mm.
Now, the second one that we want to look at is, it talks about the analyzing the role and the use of initial diagnostics and assessments in agreeing to making sure that the learners agree to those goals that are put in the individual learning plans after the initial assessment and diagnostics are done. So here, the most important part that we look at in terms of the teaching and learning process tends to be the bit in terms of how they are carried out. So if the initial assessment is carried out, thoroughly, and in some cases, if initial assessment takes the route of diagnostic assessments and they are carried out thoroughly, then it allows us to clearly understand the strengths, weaknesses, knowledge and skills, and the attitude of our learners. And if you know them beforehand, and if you understood them correctly, then it will allow you to create individual learning plans which are going to be more effective, which are going to be more meaningful, and something which learners will find it easy to accept, because they know that their trainer, their teacher, their tutor has actually understood where they're coming from, and rightly understand what are the areas in which they need help to be able to improve some of the skills, or improve some of the areas in which that would allow them to then have a meaningful learning in the class. Now, when we do talk about initial assessment and diagnostic assessment, one of the things that we are looking at carrying them out is to understand where is the baseline knowledge and
Mm.
skills of the learner when they are entering, say, for example, a particular level. So when we talk about schools, key stage 1, progress to key stage 2, we have certain baseline parameters which the students have to meet. And if they meet those parameters, then they are able to then, obviously progress to the next year, or these, step up into the next year in terms of school. Identifying, learning styles and preferences, which is something that we do now more often than before, is primarily to understand their preferences in terms of how they would want to learn. Sometimes in school, we see kids which are more prone to doing practical activities or in playful activities or play areas, essentially. And there we see a lot of learning happening, which is fast tracked with the theoretical part of the learning happening in the class. So sometimes you have to create activities which are complementary. You do theoretical activities or classroom-based activities, and then you do outdoor or MUGA-based activities. In some schools, that's how the curriculum is designed, so that there is a balance between the learners or students in this case doing practical activities to be able to learn, and then or putting what they have learned in the class into practice. And that can be done provided the preferences of learners in terms of students, how they would want to, or children in this case, school-wise, if they are looking at, if you have a good understanding of their learning styles and attitude. Now, some of the bits that we do, and I showed an example of an ILP yesterday, which was a comprehensive document. That particular document, because it talks about analysis of the role and the use of initial and diagnostic assessment, what I would suggest is that the ILP, which I had explained yesterday, would need to be, we would need to actually fill one of the ILP plans up and then explain that in a bit of narrative to say why, using initial assessment and diagnostics and then translating what we've got from there into the individual learning plan would be useful, because they would help us.
Sorry, could you just repeat that? So what are we looking at now?
So what we're going to do is, when we look at the carrying out the initial assessment and diagnostics assessment, initial assessment or diagnostic assessments, why do we carry them out? What we need to be able to show is that for the analysis part of it, we need to be able to show that if we carry out some of these initial assessments and diagnostic assessment, they give us a full proof to say what is actually the areas which we have identified as weakness areas. And those areas then need to be worked on and improved on. And for that is what we create, what are called the individual learning plans, or ILPs. And in order to create the ILP, it'll be good for us to actually use one or two initial assessments that we have done for our learners, and then let's say complete them and then translate the outcome of those initial assessments and use them to populate the ILP. And that would show a connect between the reason why we do initial or diagnostics assessments and how do we then look at translating them into an individual learning plan, which we then have the learners or students in this case agree to doing those activities and improving over a point in time by completing those activities with a particular timeline, and thereby gaining knowledge and skills which is required at that particular level.
So I'm going to have to carry these out, is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. So the ILP, which I'd shown yesterday, just as an example, is basically.
Did you show me that yesterday?
Sorry?
I'm not sure I did see that, but that's okay, as long as I've got access to it.
We discussed this document yesterday.
Yes, we did.
Yeah. And this document has a couple of pages. Obviously, it's a detailed document, not, it covers lots of things that we would want to do. Say, for example, the learning styles that we want to look at and put the output of the outcome of the learning style that we've done using WARC questionnaire into this. Then, depending on the course that they are doing, in our case, obviously, if they are looking at doing an English or maths or any such course, what we'll do is we'll do diagnostics related to that subject discipline. So in some cases, using the initial assessment and diagnostic tests, quiz, exams that we do, what we do is we put the outcome or the result of that into this particular document. And then what we are looking at is this document, as I mentioned to you, because it's an individual document and we are setting goals against timelines. We want the the assessor, which is the teacher in this case, and the student or the learner in this case to also agree to those goals. And that is why signature or inking of signature is also required to be done to ensure that, the plans which have been set are agreeable to the learner or the student in this case. And then in the subsequent pages, what we do is we write down the objectives here. What has been agreed in terms of the individual goal, whether this is a goal what I would say the goal would be related to a particular aspect that we've identified in the initial assessment or the diagnostics that we've done, and we've identified that as a gap area, and that would be translated into an objective here with a bit of a target date and a suggested completion date. And the reason why we put dates is that we are going to be looking at continuous monitoring and adaptation to ensure that if the learner is doing quite well in those activities, some of the activities could be, superseded or obviously done away with. If the learner is not meeting the set criteria, then in those cases, those activities and timelines could be extended. And that is where what I mean by monitoring and adaptation, so that the process ensures that the learning remains aligned with the learner's evolving needs and goals. And that is what we need to put here. So sometimes you start with one objective, two objectives, but over a point in time, this document, which is a working document, living document, tends to expand on some of the objectives. As you complete one milestone, you go to the next one, then you go to the next one. And that is why we say it is a working document. And the role of initial and diagnostic assessments in a teaching setting is to help put and define individual learning goals or plans, which is very fundamental to the way how we teach and assess in a classroom-based setting. And these, I'll put it this way, these plans that we create, which the learner agrees to and the assessor or the teacher agrees to, in turn facilitates an agreement, which basically ensures that these plans are very personalized to that individual. So in this particular, task that we have to do, if I just switch you back to the slide, what we have to ensure is that we basically show by populating an ILP and obviously an initial diagnostic, and then populating and the results of that being translated into an individual learning plan would show how and should basically show what is the role of initial and diagnostic assessment and why is it very important in the learning journey as far as the student is concerned or the learner is concerned. Is that okay?
I'm just not sure at the moment, practically, how that's going to work, because obviously when students come to, so basically a lot of our students come up from our primary school. So obviously we don't really do any sort of in terms of assessments for them because we obviously already know them. But it's different obviously when new students come in because we obviously don't know them and they're from outside schools within the borough. So it's just trying to think of a way that I'm going to be able to obviously do the initial assessment to then be able to do the the goals, the SMART goals and targets. I'm not sure how. I can't see how I'm going to do it at the moment.
Yeah, so basically when we look at, in your case, when you get students or children coming in from primary school, they have done some sort of diagnostic assessment, which is basically meeting the key stage 1 requirements before they progress to the next level, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
I thought you said that I had to carry out the assessment myself.
Yes, that's correct. And the report that you end up getting, which comes from the school, primary school, in such cases, is a let's say it is a result report at the end of the day, which basically shows how the learner, or in this case, the children or student, has met that criteria, and that report confirms that the learner is, meeting that criteria, and that is why they are progressing on to, the next level. So you would need to reference some part of that report, just anonymize, say, one particular report, reference it to that part, and then provide a bit of a narrative here to say how the initial assessments and diagnostics help in agreeing further goals. That means bigger goals, into a certain extent, when they are entering, or having a transition from one class to the other, or going from primary to the secondary school. Is that okay?
Hold on, just primary. secondary or different classes. So how the initial assessment helps basically in terms of either transitioning from a primary to the secondary or within, say, the secondary within different class groups.
Yeah.
So I'd be able to just sort of reference that somehow. Is that what you said?
Yeah, so in those cases, what I would say is when you look at the analysis part of it, what you're looking at is determining essentially what learning targets need to be set for the learners, using those diagnostic assessments, and then putting appropriate teaching and learning strategies to be able to, achieve them. Now, they might not happen over 1 month, 2 months. It will be across one academic year. And this would be something which will allow the learners to develop higher level skills to in some areas than probably others, because what we've done with the diagnostics is understood and let's say got proof of that these areas are the areas in which the learner's skills are lacking. And when you put those activities in the form of individual learning plan with some sort of a timeline, that allows you to understand and put a learning process in place which would be benefiting the learner essentially, and allowing the development of these higher level skills.
So I need to so what targets need to be put in place for the learner? And then obviously it needs to be some kind of time frame, hasn't it?
That is correct, yes. So in the ILP, if you see, there is an objective. In the objective, next column is primarily your target, basically a timeline, and then there is a target date of completion or review. Sometimes some of these activities could be completed earlier by the learners, and obviously you might need to adapt and move those ahead in time. And sometimes these activities could be delayed and the learners not responding to some of the activities which have been put in place. And in such cases, what you would then do is basically adjust the timeline and give more time as a teacher, and you become a facilitator there, wherein you allow more time for the learner to be able to complete those activities in order to achieve a goal.
So would this be another example, just going back to what we were looking at yesterday? So it would be a good idea. So we'd have obviously the table, wouldn't we? We'd have the target, the time frame, and then so that's going to obviously be another table within my work as evidence. Is that right?
That's correct. And I would say as you take an example of, say, some sort of a assessment that we normally end up doing, like maths or English functional skills assessment. And what we do is, once we've done the initial assessment, we then identify what is the current working level of the student. Is the student at level 1, entry level 3, or entry level 1, 2, or 3, or level 1? And if they want to progress to the next level, then what we decide is these are the skills which are critical for them to progress to the next level. And then in turn, what we will do is put these activities in place, going through, for example, if it's for maths, looking at probability, mean, median, mode, some of the activities that we feel areas or subject areas in which we feel topic areas, I will put it this way, under the subject that they are weak in, we'll put those topic activities in place, and they would then allow the learner to complete those activities in a certain timeline, thereby allowing the development of that skill.
Sorry, I'm just trying to get it straight in my head because I'm probably overthinking it, but that's obviously something I do. So could I look at that in terms of like maybe it might be easier, I think, to do it in terms of a couple of the lessons which I'm teaching, which is RSE and IT. So I think if I did it in terms of that and then maybe identified how many learners would you need to kind of do this for the ILP? Is it one learner or two?
Just one learner would do. Just one learner would do. That is not an issue. Because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is basically show the outcome of the initial assessment or diagnostics that you've done, and how does it relate to an individual learning goal or a plan.
I think that would be easier in terms of if I do it from my subject area rather than.
Yes, if that's absolutely fine. So you're contextualizing it to the like I've obviously done on the presentation, and I've contextualized some of the examples and other bits to what I teach, like strategic management. So in your case, you could obviously do it for the subject area that you would have knowledge.
RSE or IT.
Yes, absolutely fine. Is that okay? And I
I
think,
think so. I think it's just sometimes for me, it's just until I do it, it just seems, I think, more complicated than it needs to be.
yeah, I think the
I'm making it more
no,
complicated.
no, I totally agree. But I think what I that the key would lie in reading the task quite well. Because if it says analyze, I would suggest that you would need obviously something to look into first. And that would mean that you need to have maybe an evidence of some sort of diagnostic for a particular learner, then identify some of the areas which are weakness areas, gap areas, or areas in which improvements can be made, and then translate that into, because you're extracting the key bits of information from there, and that is the analysis that you're doing. And then you're translating that into an individual learning plan, which could be a template that I've shown, or a template that you have which is related or used in your organization, and that could be used to show how it helps in, agreeing and obviously putting goals together for the learner to be able to achieve using ILP. So sometimes it's the key lies in the bit in terms of the word, which is what is defining, the task.
Yeah.
That is what I would suggest, especially in some of these units, it is going to be linked to the word which is asking you to do, because we can have, um, you know, obviously, because it's a vast field, we can have lots of different connotations, lots of different ways in which this can be put together as evidence. But the idea is to try and put it in the context of where we work, how do we work, what my experience is, and what do I do or use in it on a day-to-day basis.
You haven't got an example of that, what that would look like, have you? Like in a table format or anything, like an example of the previous learners?
No, so in my case, what I've shown to you is, for example, in my case, I would look at doing, say, an initial assessment. So let me put this across to you by showing you, say, a full screen.
It's good for me. I know it's not always easy, but I think for me, I'm quite visual. So obviously the information that we're talking about is obviously quite a lot of words. So for me, it'd be good to see if you had a previous student who's actually completed it and what that looks like in terms of like an eye they've done, and then how that looks then. So I know what I'm supposed to be doing, if that makes sense.
It does, yes, but I think keeping in mind sometimes it is quite, let's put it this way, specific to specific learners. So if I were to look at how I would look at addressing this particular task, would be, because we are talking about analyzing the role of initial diagnostics or assessments in agreeing with the individual learning plan. So what I would do is primarily look at some sort of initial diagnostics first. And in my case, for example, if I do it for English or for maths, they complete this quiz. We mark that quiz at the end of the day. And then if I look at a simple version of the, the ILP, I would normally go across to a page which is on the ILP template that we have got, page 7. And what I would do is basically look at identifying some of the objectives. So if I feel that the capitalization or punctuation in this case is an area which is a weak area for the student, I'm going to put an objective here which would say that the learner would need to carry out certain activities to improve punctuation in English. I would put a target date down, which is a target date down which is understandable with a set of activities listed here, 1, 2, or 1, 2, and 3. So some activities which would guarantee that if the learner completes those religiously, those activities would then allow the learner to hone that skill, or basically do away with that particular weakness. And then I'll put a target date here, and then a suggested completion date, and then monitor it to say whether these activities have essentially allowed the learner to achieve what we were looking at doing. And that would be the learner's ability to be able to agree to that plan which has been put, and then the completion of the plan allows the learner to achieve that particular task or meet that particular goal. And that is how I would do it. Now, in some cases, learners, you might need to know and understand learners, learning styles as well, so that the activities can be put together accordingly. In those cases, if it's a very, very initial assessment that I'm doing to understand learners' preferences of how they would want to learn and their attitude towards learning, or, the activities which are going to be put together, then I would also dip into and ask the learner to fill the WARC learning style questionnaire.
That's going to be difficult for me because the learners that I work with, as I said, I've already sort of bypassed that stage because obviously I've been working with them for a long time, so I know what their learning kind of styles are. So I'm already doing it, but you obviously need an initial assessment. So how am I going to do that?
So you are going to use one of our templates of the WARC style questionnaire, which is available on Moodle in the folder, which I showed you yesterday, and download it and do it as if it has been filled by a particular learner. So you'll have to get, a bit creative on this to basically create a template, use the template that we provided, and then fill it up as a learner, and then basically bring the learnings of that into the ILP.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yep.
Good stuff. Now, the last bit that we have to look at in the assessment criteria is record learning, what the learners are actually achieving when we set goals for them, and how do we go across and obviously record their achievements. That is what we need to look at in the last assessment criteria on this particular learning outcome. Now, the recording tends to be done in very many ways. And obviously, in our case, in my institution, for example, when we look at assessments or, assessments in terms of assignments or in terms of tests, quizzes, we have a tracker and we manually maintain that. In some cases, in some schools and other institutions, we have Pro Monitor as a software which allows you to record, individual learning progress, which is being made when some of the activities and goals and targets are being, completed by the learner. There could be some sort of a template which the school uses. Sometimes there are customized templates which the schools have developed or institutions have developed over a point in time. But as long as the template is recording things which are related to the learner, for example, the learner ID, the learner name, you have a specific, ILP for example, if kids in the high school, study geography, history, English, maths, science, a lot of other subjects, and there are areas in which they're asked to attend or take additional classes or, complete additional pieces of work because they are lacking or, are falling behind, then in those cases, some of the plans which are developed tend to be individual subject-based plans as well, or goals and targets which are set tend to be individual subject basis or on certain, I would say, when we talk about the school, generally it tends to be even on a subject basis. That means if the learners or children are learning, for example, Spanish or French, and they're falling behind, they're not meeting the foundation or the fundamental, requirements to be able to pass, then those plans are going to be subject specific. These plans are reviewed by teachers, quite frequently. They are also fed back in terms of the outcomes to, in parent-teacher meetings or in journal meetings which happen with the course leader, the form tutor, or in some cases, the subjects expert within the school. But whichever way you look at it, you're looking at basically recording the progress made by the learner, in some sort of a structured template. And that would be basically looking at recording the learner's, individual learning plans. And obviously in the learning plan template that I've shown, there are places wherein at some stage, there is a way where we can clearly record that this goal has been met or this plan has been met. And that tends to be the way sometimes you would, let's say, as teachers, what we tend to do is we know there's a big goal or there's a wide gap between what the learner needs to be on and what the learner is currently on. So what we tend to do is in the learning goals or plans that we create bite-sized plans which are easy to achieve. And those then tend to be reflective of or relate to some sort of a success criteria, and then they are monitored, in a way wherein we are able to see the progress being made by the learner, and then the progress being made by what they are learning on by completing those activities allow the learners to be able to, let's say, improve or gain those skills. So in some cases, you have structured templates which are available. The ILP that I've shown as a template, there is a space in the ILP which primarily allows us to record, the progress made by the learner, and that recording of the progress essentially, which is done as a milestone by, say, for example, the assessor and the IQA, allows that to be signed off, and that signing off ensures that that the goals are being met and obviously progress is being made. But if in certain cases we see that additional support is required or additional learning is required, then the plans are further augmented in order to ensure that that we are able to hit the milestones or we are able to hit the goals. One of the things that I will also quickly show on the ILP would be that these are signed off both by the learner. If it is apprenticeships, for example, like in this case, this ILP can be used for that, then it is also signed off by the employer and the assessor primarily, who's maintaining this plan, recording the progress, and ensuring that it is fit for purpose, it is meeting the criteria, and the learner progress is being made because of the whole reason that why this ILP is actually being put into place. So, sorry. So in this case, what I would suggest is when you look at recording, you would need maybe a template, which could be a 1-page, 2-page template, or a structured template that you have within your organization. And that could be used to show how the progress of learner is actually recorded when the individual goals are set as per the initial diagnostics which are done. Is that okay?
Hold on, I'm just writing this down. Learn is.
Now, the way we look at in our case,
the main thing that we have within my particular organisation, we're obviously a special educational needs school. So each student that comes to our school has an educational healthcare plan. So
yes,
that's where the bulk, I think, of that information is going to be, like, because however, I think it's reviewed on an annual basis. So obviously there's new targets, and that's where everyone sort of comes together, like the teachers, the therapists, and they work together, obviously, to come up with new targets for these, students. And then they look at it. Did he or she meet this target, or is it met, partially met, or ongoing? So how then is that what I'm trying to incorporate into my initial assessment or not?
Yes, that is what you're trying. From that report that you have, you're trying to extract information, some parts of it, and then basically relate it to the individual goals which have been set, and then commenting on it to show how you record the progress, for the learner or for the child. If that makes sense. Now, we obviously what you need to look at is now be a bit creative in terms of finding out what are the things that you use in your educational setup to be able to do this. How do you record the progress? So in our case, for example, we have Moodle, and some of the plans that we create for ILP and progress reviews are done primarily on Moodle, or in some organizations it could be a Canvas or Pro Monitor, as I mentioned. In schools, in some cases, there's a Blackboard in universities.
So I am a little unclear. So I know that, as I said, I know every student in the school has got an EHCP, and obviously that gets that's like a live document, so that gets kind of added to as and when. But then throughout the year, in terms of like, progress in things like, maths or English, where, that's kind of more measurable. and you know they do exams, and you know they do some exams. They're doing like entry levels and functional skills.
So where do you record progress?
That information then is all the information is recorded on this system called Solar. That's where everything is stored on that system. Obviously, I don't have access to it.
So what you would need to do is narratively define that for this particular task. Maybe have a screenshot if you can get access to one, to say this is how the progress is recorded, and then that screenshot with maybe any sensitive information being blurred, you could put that on, and then underneath that describe it with a narrative to say, this is, as you're explaining to me, you're basically writing that narrative which explains how the progress is recorded, and that would do.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Obviously, in our case, you're looking at data protection, confidentiality, accessibility, all those bits, have to be taken into account. And what you could then do is at some stage, put a bit of a narrative on to say, okay, this is how it is recorded. And, that would basically show and, give an idea, very clear idea, because it talks about recording learners' individual learning goals. So how do you record it is what we need to know. And as long as you can evidence that, that would be good enough. Okay.
Yep, I think so.
Good stuff. So that brings us to the end of today's, session. We'll be looking at covering learning outcome 3 and 4 next week. And what I will do is 3, 4, 5, and hopefully I'll try and get all the presentations up, by this weekend, so that if you need to read ahead, you're able to do so, before the sessions. And then any templates, anything that I've shown, what I will do is they are already, as we are, discussing, they're already up on Moodle in that same folder, which I'm putting across. So that would allow you to access them. If you do not have maybe access to the templates from within your own organization, then at least you would have the templates available that you could use and customize to do some of the assessment criteria for the assignment.
And then are you going to you're going to send that big long list of templates, aren't you?
No, I'm not sending anything to you. I'm just putting it onto the same folder which I had mentioned to you earlier. And that folder primarily, would be the repository from which I would say you are looking at, getting hold of the templates.
Yeah, because you said, do you remember you were saying about that there's like 40 different templates, and you said you were going to send it across so I can start kind of gathering the evidence.
Yeah, so these templates are no, I didn't, and that's what I'm saying. I'm not going to send them across. They are uploaded in this particular folder, portfolio creation template. So if I go back onto the Moodle, which I show you, so I've uploaded today a sample walk style questionnaire and an ILP. Well, I had actually uploaded the ILP yesterday as well. So if you go on to the Unit 1, and under Unit 1, this folder, what I did was I moved it up next to the learning outcome 1 and 2 presentations. So if you click on this folder, this has all the templates that I was discussing with you and I mentioned. So you can download them from here. You can download the entire folder and everything comes to you straight up.
Yeah, no. So it's all there.
Good stuff.
Okay.
So it started to rain heavily here up in Manchester. I would say you enjoyed